Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 FM, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and we have on today's show representative and regular contributor, Emilie Kornheiser. Hey, Emilie.
Good morning, Olga.
And we will be talking about a topic we have not touched on since COVID, the exciting world of cannabis. And we'll be speaking with David Mickenberg, who is a lobbyist in Montpelier working right now with the Marijuana Policy Project. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Glad you can make it. And then Representative Sam Young, who represents the Orleans Caledonia District. And glad to have you this morning, Sam.
Good morning.
So let's start with, because it's been a while since we've talked about cannabis. It's been COVID all the time lately here. Why is this something we should be talking about now? And kind of like, where are we? There's been tons of bills, tons of conversations. We've been talking about this for years. Let's help remind people like why this is important and what's actually gone through the legislature at this point.
Okay.
Shall we start with you, Sam?
Well, David was going to do a little historical context. I'd let him go first.
Sure. Well, maybe Sam can talk about the why, and I can talk about where we are right now.
Perfect.
For the last, really for the last, I'd say, couple of decades, the Vermont Legislature has been grappling with the issues related to cannabis legalization and cannabis policy broadly. In a variety of different forms. Really started a couple of decades ago with a conversation about medical cannabis, medical marijuana. And Vermont was one of the first, I believe the first state in the country to pass through its legislature a medical cannabis bill. Most of the legislation that has passed around the country, even today, has been through ballot initiative. And I know there's a lot of folks in Vermont that say, why can't we just do this? Or why does this seem so hard? Well, as Emilie and Sam know, the legislative process is slow and on big issues like this can take quite some time. So there's been an evolution. So we started in Vermont with a medical cannabis bill that was essentially allowing folks for medicinal purposes to possess and grow your own cannabis. And that was on the books for quite some time and was a struggle to get even there. But for many, that was not a sufficient system, still required people to venture into we'll call the illicit market to purchase cannabis if they were not going to be able to grow it their own. And also it didn't provide the level of protections in terms of consumer protection for patients, knowing what you're getting, having a sufficient variety of products and things like that. So the legislature about 10, 12 years ago took action to create the medical dispensary system, which would establish medical dispensaries where patients could buy cannabis and know that it had been sort of where it had been grown, the variety of products that had been tested and things like that. So that system currently exists. From there, we in Vermont went on to decriminalize, one of the first states in the country to decriminalize cannabis through our legislature in the recent history. And that was in the face of both the medical dispensary and decriminalization in the face of Washington, which was very hostile, federal government hostile to cannabis policy in the states. And so then from there, we've been having this robust discussion over the last 4 or 5 years about cannabis legalization. And Vermont did become the first state in the country to legalize cannabis for adults 21 and over. Again, we started sort of similar to how we did with the medical program. We started with a legalization regime which allows you to grow your own and allows you to possess it legally for people over the age of 21. So That's kind of the current state of the law. We have medical cannabis decriminalization and grow your own and personal possession. And over the last number of years, 3 or 4 years, we've had a number of bills debated in both bodies related to what some refer to as tax and regulate, or adult use, or retail sales of cannabis, where non-medical patients, like they have in about 11 other states, Massachusetts being our closest, right down the road from you all, where adults who are not there for medical purposes can 21 and over go and purchase cannabis as they would purchase many other types of substances legally through a system that is highly regulated for consumer protection. And so that bill, fast forwarding to the current state of affairs, a bill S54 was passed by the Senate in 2019, went through the legislative process in the House through a variety of committees. I don't know, Emilie or Sam, you might know, something like 10 or 11 committees touched the bill at some point. Almost every committee.
Almost every committee, yeah.
Yeah, virtually every committee in the legislature has looked at this bill. Passed the Senate with overwhelming support, and just this past spring passed the House again with really strong support, somewhere in the 90s, 92, 93, something like that. Tripartisan support, Republicans, progressives, Democrats, independents, all supporting it. And where the bill is now is in what we refer to as a conference committee, which is where the two bodies reconcile their differences. So that's kind of the current state, the history and the current state of affairs, and I'll pause there.
Thanks, David. One quick question, just for my own education. When you were talking about when Vermont passed, the adults over 21 can possess plants and grow their own. You said we were the first in the nation. I thought Colorado.
So we were the first legislature to pass a legalization bill for adult possession, non-medical. Illinois sort of leapfrogged us because Illinois went on through their legislature to pass a tax and regulate bill and became the first state in the country to pass a full system, a robust system of regulation of cannabis sales, creating an industry which the numbers just came out. There's been hundreds of millions of dollars in sale in Illinois, and I think $52 million in revenue in the last quarter or something like that for the state of Illinois. But Colorado was by referendum, like Washington, California, Nevada, many of the other states is done by referendum. So
Massachusetts too.
Yeah. Massachusetts as well, right?
Thank you for that clarification. Appreciate
Sure.
it. And so right now, the bill is in conference committee. So, with this kind of topsy-turvy legislative session we've had, what's next for this bill? Do you think we'll see anything pass this year, or what are some of the details that still need to be hashed out? That's probably even the better question.
Sam, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, sure. I don't really know where it's at, except that, the conference committee is important because there's been a ton of work. We got it through all stages of passage, and it's just this kind of last little negotiation that needs to happen. The last thing that we did before we left the State House was the Speaker appointed the conferees for the House, but in the 3 months since then, they've never met to discuss the bill between the House and the Senate. So, granted, there was a global pandemic on, so we had some other things to take care of, but it would seem like it should be easy enough to meet and iron out those differences. The Senate kind of did like more of a bare bones bill, and the House filled in a lot of different policy details. And I would say that the one other, the differences between the House and Senate, I think, should be pretty easy to negotiate. The one that I think is the sticking point is that the governor still wants warrantless collection of bodily fluids, and we had a vote on that in the House, and we did not support that. I thought there was a pretty good system to, you know, if somebody was intoxicated, that you could get a warrant for their bodily fluids, but you need to have some process around that is not just like the willy-nilly collection of just anybody the police think that, like, oh yeah, we want to check you, and just like without any real process around it. So that one is actually, you know, even if we get the House and Senate to agree on everything else, that's the one between the governor and the legislature that's probably going to be the last sticking point. And I don't think that we would have the votes for a veto override on this bill. We were around 90, I think, votes for it, but not that magic 100.
And that's been a sticking point for a while for the governor about safety and traffic and driving while impaired.
That's true, and you know, we did the committees looked at it, and he wasn't so specific until the very end, where oh no, a warrant was too far. You know, we couldn't possibly have due process. So.
I know, it always gets in the way.
You know, given the conversations that we're having nationally and within Vermont about racial justice and especially criminal justice reform, and we know about the history of the war on drugs having a disproportionate impact on communities of color, it seems, you know, now more than ever, we want to make sure that we're not passing new legislation that will increase bias in policing. And so the more we can add checks and balances into that system, the better, especially given this particular topic's weightiness around communities of color. I think Vermont's had a pretty good history on that particular issue when we look at cannabis reform. You know, expungement was paired with decriminalization. Was that right, David? Or was it the one after that?
Yeah, there's been an expungement process, although there's also a separate bill which actually during the Zoom session, what I'm calling the Zoom session after we left, passed the Senate and is now awaiting action in the House to do an automatic expungement, which would be for cannabis as well. They sort of figured out how to do that without overwhelming the system sort of logistically. So we're really encouraged and think that bill would really pair well with S54 and all of the components of S54, which help to address the social equity parts of cannabis and the cannabis industry. So,
and let's go back all the way to the beginning and remember that marijuana criminalization was a racist law to begin with. So. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, if one of you could remind us, because the legislature did try very hard to make sure there was some social equity in that bill, could you just remind us, one of you, what some of those points were, those actions taken?
Sure, I take a quick stab at that, and others can fill in. But one of the most important pieces in the bill is prioritization for licensing. So for who gets the licensing, and there's specific prioritization in the bill for people of color, women, and those who have been historically impacted disproportionately by the war on drugs. So at the very outset, that must be a consideration taken in by the board as they look at the licensing process. There's also other provisions about technical assistance for those that have been impacted by the war on drugs. And I think frankly, the piece and a big emphasis in what the House did was emphasize small growers and facilitating small growers' participation in the market. And what makes the ability of folks that have historically been unable to access credit and things like that. The barrier to entries are very high sometimes for the cannabis industry, to, you know, buy a grow shop or buy a grow facility, to be able to staff up, all those things. So the emphasis on small growing, and in the bill, the House bill, they defined small growers as 1,000 square feet or less. So I think that's another piece, while not specifically related to people of color, really is what we've seen in other states. The barrier to entry is difficult, and that will sort of lessen the barrier to entry by emphasizing a small grower community of as many folks as possible. So those are a couple of the provisions.
I was really particularly excited about those provisions because I think they're great examples of things we can do in other legislation as well that's not related to cannabis, around economic equity for historically marginalized populations. The access to capital, I think, is really important for people to understand that because cannabis is still illegal nationally, traditional sort of loan mechanisms through banks are not available. And so populations that have access to family funds, friends funds, social networks where money flows more easily have a much easier time accessing the industry, and ownership structures can sort of easily be turned over to folks with capital. And so we did a lot in this bill to both ease access to entry with these smaller growers and then make sure that ownership stays very closely regulated.
Yep. There's one other piece that David didn't mention, which was it's not because you have a low level drug offense necessarily on your record, we did not disqualify you from participating in the industry, which was something that happened in other states initially. And it's, you know, if we're saying that this should be legal, we shouldn't actually also disqualify you from the industry because you knew that it should be legal before the legislature did.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and one point that's sort of I think sort of tangential to the bill, but also relates to what we're talking about here, is what does the current system do in terms of racial equity and gender equity? And right now, sort of in our current system of decriminalized cannabis in Vermont, and people growing at home, because of the historical targeting of people of color, that system is not conducive to for a lot of folks, and the fear associated with growing your own cannabis or things like that, fearing a police interaction, is really problematic. So in and of itself, the creation of a regulated marketplace, and yes, folks need to be able to access capital and be able to get licenses and all those things, but the creation in and of itself of a regulated marketplace, I think, goes a long way of really taking away many of the problems associated with the war on drugs, the war on people of color through the war on drugs, and the war on cannabis has really been the tip of the spear of the war on drugs. And I think all of the provisions, and there may be more provisions that are put in through the conference committee or negotiated through the conference committee, we'll see. But certainly the creation of the system itself, I think, goes a long way of helping to reduce police interactions, helping to reduce the historical targeting of communities of color. So.
Thanks. One piece of that I've been emphasizing when I talk to folks in Windham County who really want to stick to grow your own is that really prioritizes folks who own their own home, because growing your own in a rental is very iffy in the best of times, especially if you're in subsidized housing in some way. And so we know that white people are much more likely to own their own home because of redlining, because of, you know, generational wealth accumulation, et cetera. And so again, that's prioritize, you know, this is without this, we're creating a system that's really much more available for white people.
Thank you, Emilie. Sam, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say that I found it interesting. I stopped by the dispensary down in Northampton, and what do you have down there? You have the police directing traffic to make sure everybody can park in an orderly way, and I think that's a more appropriate role for them.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other thing. Sorry,
go
Olga.
ahead, Emilie. No, go ahead.
And maybe we're about to go to a break, and this is a more appropriate conversation for after a break. I want to talk about revenue and what that means post-COVID, as well as if we really want to transition people into a legal marketplace, what prices need to look like to do that well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just quickly, we do have a few minutes before we go to break. I was curious too, what has the legislation done around infrastructure? Because I know talking to we have a few processors down in this neck of the woods, there's still a lot of infrastructure that's missing around, yes, people can grow, but is there enough processors? Are there enough testing labs? Are there enough those kind of support infrastructures? Does this legislation touch on that at all, as far as access to capital and putting in those other kind of pieces of infrastructure?
Not necessarily access to capital, but what it does do is it creates licensed categories which would allow people to be product manufacturers, so processors, testing labs, wholesalers, cultivators, retail outlets. So it creates, because currently, if you were a processor now, if this bill were to pass and to become law, you couldn't just start processing cannabis. Really, the processors that are in Vermont are really processing for hemp and for CBD. So you would have the infrastructure built up, but you would have to then go through the licensing process through the cannabis board to get a new license. So the bill does contemplate having that infrastructure in place. It will just be created through this new legal regime and regulatory regime. And
it's a staged rollout, so that the labs come online, the growers start before and then the retail sales pieces happen after that. And it's also kind of in the bill that you could only have one license of each category. And the current dispensaries would be considered, if they have each one of those functions, could have one kind of integrated license, but only one for each category.
And that's kind of to protect against like a monopoly or a
yeah. So we don't have the Starbucks of cannabis all around the state.
Fantastic, thank you. So stay tuned with us. We are going to hear from some of our underwriters in a second here on WVEW LP Brattleboro 107.7 FM. But in the meantime, when we come back, Emilie, David, Sam, and I will be talking about revenue related to cannabis and how that could be important post-COVID. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro 107.7 FM, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and I am speaking with Representative Emilie Kornheiser, David Mickenberg, who is a lobbyist working with the Marijuana Policy Project in Montpelier, as well as Representative Sam Young, and we are talking about cannabis. And, as I always must say, the views and opinions expressed by the host and the guests of this show are our opinions and not those of the radio station. So in other words, if you want to send angry letters, you send them to us and not WVEW. So, Sam, I had to smile when you said you went down to Northampton lately and past the dispensary, because I get my hair cut in Northampton. And so it's like on those Saturdays when I'm getting my hair cut, the line of traffic and the line of people lined up at the dispensary on, I think it's Conn Street, always amazes me. And yes, the police do a very good job there of directing the traffic. And but it makes me wonder, you know, watching Massachusetts, our neighbor, tax and regulate cannabis, are there any lessons learned from that, or are we seeing any trends that were like, yes, we definitely, this really solidifies why we want to move towards a tax and regulate system?
Well, it's interesting. I don't want to, before we answer that question, I want to sort of highlight that it doesn't always look like Northampton. So last summer when we were sort of halfway through the debate in the House around cannabis legislation, I wanted to get my head around what this actually looked like. And so I took a little, and I don't smoke, it's just not, I prefer alcohol, as we've talked about on the happy hour before, but went on a little field trip. And so I checked out the dispensary in Greenfield and one in the Berkshires and went to the one in Northampton. And they're all very, very different and have a very different vibe that's very sort of fitting with their community. And so Northampton's was the only one that I went to that seemed to have a line of out-of-state cars, seemed to have that like really urgent vibe, whereas the one in Greenfield is just like, you know, sleepy Greenfield style on a back street, and you know, you walk in and it's fairly empty. And the one in the Berkshires had like more of a little hippie vibe, and they're very fitted to each of their communities, even though, you know, each one has, you know, a very intact security system. Each one has a clear variety of, you know, options that you get to choose. You need to show ID at each of them. So that was really interesting to me, that even within this very strict regulatory regime, you could still have the sort of retail flavor that someone wanted to pass on. Some of them felt much more pharmaceutical. Some of them felt much more sort of hip lab kind of Apple store kind of thing.
Thank you, Emilie.
Yeah.
Because that is a lot of concern we hear from our local communities is what would this do to our community, and do we even want to grant licenses within our town? So,
and one sort of detail of the sort of way the regulation is paired to size is that in some universe we could imagine sort of a farm stand that's regulated tightly enough to allow this, which I could see to be a very sort of Brattleboro, Westminster kind of thing to do.
Sam, did you want to add something?
I think Sam wants to make fun of Brattleboro now.
Go for it.
No, I would never do such a thing. Maybe I'm going to run statewide someday, Emilie.
Thinking ahead.
What a lovely community you have there.
We are unique.
Oh, sorry, Sam. Were you gonna jump
No,
in?
go for it.
Okay. I was gonna say, yeah, I think it's really interesting to see the sort of variety of different retail outlets and the variety of products that are being manufactured, and Massachusetts has had its ups and downs in terms of certainly around social equity licensing and getting communities on board quick enough, so there hasn't been enough licenses out there. But one thing that carries throughout all of these dispensaries is that there is a robust regulatory regime, and it really is focused on the safety of the consumers. So I just saw recently the Cannabis Control Commission in Massachusetts fined one producer for, I believe, using pesticides of some sort. But right now, I mean, Vermont has a market. We have a robust cannabis market. It's just not a regulated market. Hundreds of millions of dollars of sales. The RAND report a couple of years ago estimated our cannabis market to be around $250 million, something like that. But unlike Massachusetts, if you're not growing your own cannabis, then you're acquiring it illicitly and illegally, and most importantly, in an unregulated manner. So you have no idea what's on it, what it's been grown in, all of those things. And so the story of Massachusetts, I think, right in our back door, is a story of consumer protection, first and foremost, and really being able to have a system that that says that when you go to a dispensary, to the greatest extent possible, you're going to be protected from unhealthy types of additives and things like that. And if it's not happening, that there's a regulatory regime in place to make sure that it does. So I sort of want to get out of the mentality that Vermont's creating an industry. An industry exists. We are bringing that industry into the sort of light of the law and regulation, which some people may not want, and I understand that. But for the vast majority of consumers, that is really important. So
that was one in more private conversations with colleagues in my caucus. I started to joke that the debate in the House had really come down to people who realize that everyone in Vermont is high all the time, and those of us, those who don't, which was really just a joking way of saying that we have a very, very robust network of growing and selling throughout the state that doesn't have the environmental regulations tied to it and doesn't have the safety regulations tied to it.
And it is, Vermont actually does have the highest use per capita of any state in the nation, just under Colorado's, but that's always been kind of this kind of, and you know, that's the kind of, I mean, yes, it's not illegal anymore, but you know, when you have 20% of the population doing something on a regular basis, doesn't that kind of warrant that it's more mainstream than it's not an outlier anymore. It's mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, there has been opinion polling after opinion polling, both in Vermont and nationally, that has shown that a really strong majority of both Vermonters and Americans now support the full legalization of cannabis, and it's really one of the very rare bipartisan issues across the country. So blue states, red states, purple states, there's really strong support for ending this really failed policy of criminalization of cannabis.
So when I think about us actually finishing this biennium and not having to start again from scratch next biennium, we have some period of time in August and September. We don't really know how long that period of time is. Perhaps there are people who do, that we're going to focus on the budget and we're going to pass just a few bills. And so when I think about what would help this legislation get to the top of that list, for me, the first thing is revenue, that we're about to enter a period of some serious challenges with our budget. And so that's really exciting. And then I also, when I first entered this debate, was really concerned about communities' hopes for how much money would come pouring in and how much money we're actually talking about here.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if we could unpack why it's not as much magical money as we imagine it to be.
I pulled up the numbers from the Joint Fiscal Office just to remind myself how much money we're talking about, and of course this was, you know, assuming that this bill passed in July, and that, you know, there's this, it takes a while to get the Cannabis Control Board up and running and the regulations, but this was talking about, you know, in the first year, there's like low, middle, and high ranges, but in the first year, like the high range of revenue was, which was fiscal year 21, was going to be $300,000. Year two, high, 3.4 to $6.5 million. Year three, 5.6 to 10.6, and like year four, which is kind of like, if you look at other states, it's kind of fully developed market, the range being 7.3 to 13.9, and that's the total. And then the way that it got broken down in the bill was that 30% of the revenues would go towards a prevention fund or prevention treatment fund, and So basically a hunk of the revenue would be broken off for that use. And then just, I mean, there's a cost to setting up the regulatory structure, making sure that we, you know, have the lab to test the test products. And so all of that costs money. And there's actually, in the end of it, there's not really that much left over.
Although, yeah,
there is some. And you don't know until you do it. There definitely will be some money available, but it's not like, I know I hear people saying, oh, we could just reduce property taxes by it. It's just not that kind of money.
yeah.
It's not 1.6 billion.
Right. I agree that it's not going to bail out our budget deficit of whatever, $200-300 million. There will be money, and I do think those estimates were conservative based on the experience in other states. And it somewhat depends on what happens. Are we going to have tourism in Vermont again? Is that, you know, that's could be a big part of the sales. But there's one piece that's not reflected in the fiscal note, which is really the economic activity associated with creating this industry. And it doesn't account for, you know, the number of new businesses, and not even plant touching businesses, security firms, real estate companies, construction, soil companies, lighting companies, because, you know, there's a lot of regulation associated with this. There's going to be a lot of needs. And I think that there's going to be economic activity generated as a result of this industry that's not going to be reflected in the numbers in revenue. And it will lead to more revenue, more jobs. I mean, here we are, safest state or second safest state vis-a-vis COVID, trying to attract sort of new businesses and new industries here. This is an opportunity for a young new business or new part of our economy to really grow in actually places like where Sam lives. You know, the idea of having sort of the Vermont brand being in beautiful places up in the country where this plant is being grown, I think is exciting for a lot of people. So I don't think those revenue numbers, I think, are one, conservative, but also even if they're not, I think the economic gain is going to be quite significant. And I don't hear of any other discussion in the legislature about the creation of an industry like this. So I'm hopeful that there's going to be certainly a really positive benefit economically from this bill.
What I appreciate about thinking about a Vermont cannabis industry and tourism is that often, and we talk about this quite a bit on the Montpelier Happy Hour, tourism jobs are rarely living wage jobs. And the cannabis industry, from what I understand for how we were sort of prioritizing regulation and licensing, is we're looking at living wage jobs here. And so when I think about Vermont branded cannabis, like Vermont branded beer and all of Vermont branded cheese and all of the magic that seems to create in the national imagination, it has a lot of opportunities for jobs that are more just than some of the other jobs that we have in sort of our tourism necks of the woods. I also want to name that if one of our policy goals here is to move the black market out into the light, that we can't tax it to death. We need to make sure that prices in the regulated market are on par with prices in the black market, and that's a difficult thing to do.
One last thing on revenue. So it's the revenue numbers that Sam was referring to, because cannabis is illegal federally, only focus on in-state sales, whether it's people coming here to stay here and buying or Vermont residents. I think Vermont needs to look beyond, start thinking about this industry beyond in-state sales when federal legalization happens, which some would say could be as soon as a presidential election change or within a few years after that, creating this type of system that that Emilie just described, so that our brand can be exported once it's legal to do so, our brand can be exported out of state. And I think when that happens, we will see those revenue numbers frankly explode, as we have for our amazing cheese and our beer and our spirits and other things. So
and it's also really important to set that up now, so that we have a robust industry here that's even, I mean, it can be all of the things that we want. It can be small scale, it can be, you know, focused on the community. But as soon as it happens federally, Vermont will be awash in product from other states. You can't stop commerce from going across state lines. And we also, so, you know, now is the time that we have to establish a brand and get, you know, get our products together, so that then we'll be ready when a federal legalization happens, and it can go. It can go in two directions, not just one.
And y'all might not know this, but down here, we have a very intense local beer rush that happens on the weekends, where beers that are only available within Vermont borders, there's a whole network of folks in Massachusetts and New York that seem to know the delivery schedule at our local stores for those beers, and come and buy cases and cases individually to bring back to their communities. It's very strange to watch, and I don't think it happens in other parts of the state. But
we have a similar thing in Greensboro because of Hill Farmstead being here.
Yes.
You know, it's and now it's just cars lined up on the road, because he's basically shut it down to nobody's going in anymore, and so there's just this line of cars on the road and people getting beer put in their trunks.
And so I think that kind of sort of baby step is a really helpful way of building brand recognition, because it excites people, so that when national legalization takes place, we are sort of positioned through those like whisper networks of, you know, food trends.
The experience of Vermont, not just the brand.
Exactly.
People actually want to come and bring back. So I'm curious, we talked a little bit about how the governor has had his reservations around creating a tax and regulate system. But I'm curious, because it so often feels like Groundhog Day when we're talking about cannabis legislation. Are there other things that people are getting hung up with, which is why this legislation hasn't moved forward sooner? Or is it just, it's taking the time it needs to take? Who wants to jump on that grenade?
I mean, I will. It's, you know, it's been very difficult also with the Speaker of the House, and honestly, people who support cannabis legalization could give the Speaker's office a call, and, you know, just reminder that it's the bill is still there and they'd like to see it pass this year, because even if we pass it now, we're still talking about 1.5 to 2 years before we have like open stores that we can go into and purchase cannabis. So it's not like there's no rush on this, but it has been very difficult every step of the way to get over the Speaker's reservation. So it's not just the governor that has been, it's been difficult to, but, you know, here's the thing. We've gone through all of the committees. We've been through all of the process. We've done the work. We've actually cleared all of those reservations. We've got 90 votes in the House, and it would be absolutely ridiculous to go through all of that work over again. And then it truly would be Groundhog Day. I mean, I remember when I first got to the House 10 years ago, we couldn't even talk about decriminalization. Like, that was a bridge too far. And so it is like incremental each time we take another bite at it. I mean, we had to pass the legalization bill that we did so that people could grow their own. It was actually, it was part of a two-step process of, because there was a bunch of people in the House that's all they would vote for. But then you had to do that in order so you could get people on board with full legalization, because then there was this whole other group of people that would say, well, now that it's legal, I definitely want to tax it. So that's how we've actually kind of built the coalition to get up to, the number of votes that we have now, and a couple of election cycles where we kind of changed over the makeup of the body was required. We had to have a lot of retirements before we could actually get the votes in the House.
I think some of the louder reservations that were in the House were about people who didn't seem to fully understand that it's already legal. Who, when we were having debates, were debating, the harm to the teenage brain, or the sort of challenges around, intoxication generally, and seemed to, and sort of slowly their voices were whittled down around a conversation of, this is already legal. This is already legal. We are not debating legalization. We are debating regulation. And so it's hard to believe that there is still, that there are still reservations about this.
I mean, I agree. There've been many hurdles that we've had to overcome to get to this point. And I also think it would be really a shame if we didn't just resolve the differences between the body, negotiate with the governor, and get this moving. I've been encouraged, I guess, by comments by the speaker and the majority leader to say that this is going to be something in August that's going to be looked at and taken up. I mean, it's very rare to get a bill all the way to conference committee, a bill that both bodies like overwhelmingly support, and have the bill just languish there, particularly even if it provided $1 million of new revenue. Well, that's $1 million. I mean, when we go through the budget and the end of the session and looking at, we're talking $50,000, $100,000 for this program or that program. Well, that's much needed revenue. And then more broadly, it's just really this moment, as we were talking about earlier, this moment in time as we're having this really intense and important and essential examination of criminal justice and criminal justice policy. Well, this is totally integrated into that. And I think I'm hoping that we can come back in August and see this through that lens as well. It's always been that. It's just now those other issues have made it to the national forefront of discussion, or even the state to the front of our discussions, and to appreciate that when we talk about the war on drugs and the war on cannabis, it's a war on people of color and poor people. And so, I'm trying to remain, maybe I'm Pollyannish, but I'm trying to remain hopeful that that after all this work and after we start to appreciate how tied into all of these really important issues this issue is, that the legislature will come to some resolution. But that won't happen, and just a little sort of plug here for citizen action, that won't happen unless people are pushing their state reps and their senators and the speaker and the governor and the pro tem to really move this and prioritize this, because there are a lot of other competing priorities. COVID-19 is huge, all the economic impacts, things like that. But this is so close in the process that to not have this get over the finish line would be a real shame. But people should contact their reps and their senators and community leaders and others to really say, this is an important part of the overall picture of our state, and we should move forward.
But you don't have to call. I was going to say, you don't have to call Emilie, because we all know she supported it.
That's
She
right.
is. She's had many conversations with her neighbors about it.
But to that point, even calling your rep, let's say you have a rep that is supportive, well, they may be supportive and voted for it, but they may not be telling the leadership team or the speaker, this is a priority for mine in August. And yes. I think we need to get to the point where some of the advocacy comes from the body, where representatives that start to appreciate this is an important issue for our body. We voted on it. We've already taken the hard votes and done all the hard work. We want to see it through. So it's both citizens Vermonters talking to their reps, but then the reps also talking to the leadership of their body, the Senate or the House, to say this is a priority for us. So.
And can you
good idea, David?
On the conference committee, because
what's that?
On the conference committee, I think it's we have some folks from Windham County. So we have John Gannon on the conference committee, rep from Wilmington, and we have Senator Jeanette White on the conference committee, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Who else is on there?
Representative LeClaire from Barrie, and Representative Ansel from Calais. And in the Senate, it's Senator Sears, Senator White, and I believe Senator Benning. So, yeah.
We are just out of time, so we should sign off. I want to thank Representative Sam Young, David Mickenberg, and Representative Emilie Kornheiser for being on the show today. Emilie, do you have a quick toast? If not, I do. So we always like to toast at the end of the happy hour. And so I want to toast you for joining us at this early hour. Thank you. And I also want to toast to baby steps, because even though they're frustrating, I think some very smart decisions have been made around legalization and regulation around cannabis through all these years of kind of getting it right and getting it right again. So here's to baby steps.
Cheers.
I am toasting
Cheers.
incrementalism. I never thought that would happen, but thanks, Olga.
You're like a full-fledged legislator now.
Oh my
Emilie.
gosh.
Toasting
This
incrementalism.
is terrible.
Every Friday at 2 on WVEW LP Brattleboro 107.7 FM, as well as our Vermontitude SoundCloud page, our Vermontitude Facebook page. And Emilie, just quickly, where can people find you if they have questions?
EmilieKornheiser.org, eKornheiser@gmail.com, eKornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we are restarting our community Zoom conversations every Saturday in a couple weeks. And I will post about that on Front Porch Forum, as well as all the other places I just listed. Hope to see you out in public someday in the future.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Take care.